So a warm welcome to the 2023 edition of Eurodad's Policy Forum. It's really nice to see you all again in person. It was a fantastic experience coming out of lockdown into the international conference last year, but after two virtual policy forums in 2020, where we just went into lockdown, and in 2021, it's great to have this moment, particularly with Eurodad's members, because that's what the policy forum really is about. Eurodad's members, our allies in Europe, but also some of our close allies globally, and a warm welcome to the people who are going to be joining us for this panel, close friends, Bhumika and Liddy and Amanda. But I will leave the introduction to the panel to Yolanda in a moment. This is just a short word to say that we're going to be doing this policy forum over a day and a half. We start with an opening plenary, a conversation that we have long been having in different spaces, including in the Secretariat, about an alternative economic model, which is not based on extractivism, really based on care. Really interested in hearing what the discussion is like this afternoon during the panel discussion. It will be 1.5 hours that we will have the opportunity to hear the panelists and have a discussion. And over to you, Yolanda.
Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot, Jean, for that introduction. And into the panel, I'm really sorry for those who were here this morning, but you're stuck with me also through the afternoon. From an extractivist model to a care economy, what is the economic model that we want is too much of a question for 90 minutes, but we'll try to gather some insights from our wonderful panel. Let me first introduce a little bit what we mean by this title. Starting from the recognition that this mass consumption and economic growth in global north countries is sustained by this by existing asymmetric relationships of exchange of labor, land, energy, materials, but also finance with global south countries. Economic growth in the global north is predicated in this extractive relationship. I remember a recent conversation with Bhumika on the drain of resources that the global north growth is based on. Drain of mineral resources, natural resources, fossil fuels, but also financial resources through the financial systems, but also labor and work, particularly of migrant communities. And now we see all these narratives about the green growth and the green transition, particularly in the global north, with this notion of decoupling growth from the negative economic and environmental impacts that it has had until now. But so far, we're not seeing in these economic growth narratives a recognition of this unequal exchange, of this drain of, again, materials, financial, labor, etc. Also, these green growth narratives are sustained in the assumption that economic growth and sustained growth can be based on technological fixes. That we don't really need to change the mode of production or the mode of consumption just by changing some technological issues and decarbonizing part of the economy will be okay, without recognizing that these technological fixes are actually based on a continuation of this drain, particularly mineral and financial drain. And moreover, also, again, this new green growth model fails to acknowledge the care economy, the work that particularly women, or mostly women, do unpaid or underpaid in the home and outside the home on the care economy. So this panel will examine how we can build an economic model that is not based on extractivism, on this drain, and that upholds the centrality of care and sustainability of life. And I would add here, not any life, not any care, a life that is worth living, that is dignified. So it's not just about survival. It's sustainability of life goes beyond that. The objective is to start the conversation and see where we go from here. To have this conversation, we have 4 amazing panelists. Here in Brussels with us, Nicola Schroeder, Director of Political Coordinator of the ODG, the Debt Observatory in Globalization in Barcelona, one of the Eurodat members. Online, we have Bhumika Mushala, political economist and senior advisor at the Third World Network. Good morning, it's early morning in the US. We also have Lydie Natsil, coordinator of the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development. Hi, Lydie. And we also have Amanda Janot, an economics and policy lead at the Wellbeing Economic Alliance. Welcome, Amanda. I'm going to try to dynamize a dialogue between all of you. I'll be addressing questions to different people in the panel, but please feel free also to ask for the floor if you have something to add. And we'll be starting with Nicola because she's here. I mean, as I was saying, the starting point of the discussion is that the current extractivist economic model and the mainstream alternative, which could be defined as this green growth, are incapable of achieving just transition and climate justice. Is this an accurate diagnosis, Nicola? 5 minutes or shorter. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Yes, and thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. I think it's the first time that I can speak from our work on eco-social and eco-feminist transition, actually, which ODG have been working now for 8 years, and especially on eco-feminist transition for 5 years. So thank you very much for giving this space. I think that's really necessary and really appreciated. Question, is it accurate diagnosis that green growth is incapable to go or to push forward a just transition? Yes. It's the short answer, basically. Yes, it is. I think what we have been also mentioned a lot is, yes, it's incapable because it's based green growth on an already unjust global colonial structure. So the just aspect really has to take this into account. You already mentioned it, that in order to push for green growth, especially in the global north, we need these raw materials. That's one example. We need raw materials to build our windmills, to build our electric cars. And we need this so much that we push forward towards a new wave of new colonial extractivism in the global south, but now it's on raw materials. This is one aspect. And I think it's important now to link also the zones which we call sacrifice zones. ODG have been traveled to Chile and to Argentina in December to visit communities affected by this European green digital transition. We went to Chile, just to put names, because I think it's really important to humanize also these impacts now of green growth. Chile, the region of Antofagasta, lithium extraction, or El Salar de Acambama copper, the biggest copper mine. Okay, sorry for my pronunciation. Chuquicamata, where it's really a region affected by new and really large renewable projects and green hydrogen. So everything which now gets the label green has its impact on the people on these territories. But not only in the global south, also in Catalonia. That's where ODG is really connected to the movements. We also have our sacrifice zones in Catalonia, where fertile lands will be occupied by these mega infrastructure renewable projects. So it's not about only north and south, it's about sacrifice zones we can find all around, and we will find it more in the future. Extractivism also is intensive in CO2 extra emissions, so we'll get more into it, but it can't be just presented as a forced solution. Green growth, if it's based on activism where we emit so much CO2 because we need fossil fuels to extract, then we need fossil fuels still to transport these materials to the global north. And I think I will just leave it here and take over to my colleagues.
Thank you. Thanks for those initial inputs. I'm going to turn into Amanda. Anything to add to that? Do you also agree with that statement of the incapability of green growth to produce just transition? So, sorry, we're stuck with Nicola now. I'll get back to you, and maybe Nicola, we can go into another question and get back to them. In front of that diagnosis, is an economy centered on care and sustainability of life possible? Is it possible to build something different?
Yes, I'm sorry, will you? I'll have another advancing your ideas. You also wanted to say, yeah, well, the short answer is again, yes, totally possible. So, yes, I think it is possible. We have to keep in mind that when we talk about care economy, it is an anti-capitalist proposal, actually, because it is against putting the accumulation of capital. So accumulation of capital is the main driver for our capitalist system, and it's just a contra proposal of not putting the accumulation of capital in this, and it's much more like this, but I think at the essence it's really important to keep this into mind. And so yes, it is possible to center around different values. Just to take in mind that the care economy is, so what is on the center of the care economy? I think it's really important to say that it's the collective rights we try to put into this center and to put it around. We have the technicians here. Okay, I will go on saying? I will see, okay. Okay, so care economy, feminist perspective on the economy is to put the collective rights into its center and to recognize that we are interdependent. So it means we need care. We need to rely on care. We need to care because of surviving, but also to live what you said, to live a decent life. Sorry, decent life worth to be living. And here comes in also the proposal of ecofeminism, and I'm really happy, and I know if you also work on ecofeminism, but I think it's important not only care economy, but to talk also into account the eco-dependency. So this is the addition in ecofeminism, the addition which comes from the ecological politics, to say we are also eco-dependent, we need a healthy environment to live. And we need to have this in the center of our economic activities. And what it means more into detail, actually, I'll have more detailed proposals how it can be possible, but actually I would really love to hear first my colleagues.
We can try again. Okay. Yes. Okay. So let's try. Amanda, I'm gonna go back to the original question on whether you think green growth is capable of providing a just transition.
Hi everyone. Good morning, afternoon to you all. So I think that Nicola already made a lot of really important points around really how green growth, or really just the growth narrative itself, maintains very colonial sort of paradigms and structures and systems. I think to start off with, maybe I'll just like take a step back and share a little bit from how I came to this sort of perspective. So prior to working for We All, I worked as an industrial policy expert for the UN and other international development agencies. And industrial policy is really just old school development policy in the sense that governments are supposed to protect and promote certain kinds of economic activities or sectors that they believe are going to be important for their development. And in that work, I think the major value I really ever brought to these discussions was just keep asking the question, why? Like, why do you want economic growth? Why do you want foreign direct investment? Like, why do you want to increase export competitiveness? Because that's what would allow you to understand what the real development goals of the community or of the country were. And those questions are very rarely asked in economic policy discussions because there's an implicit assumption that it's always going to be growth, right? That the growth is a means and an ends in and of itself and the definition of our development. But when you ask these questions, you realize that the answers were different, right? So in Ukraine, it was peace. In Myanmar, it was rural urban inequality reduction. In Mozambique, it was resilience. And these goals were really important to understand because if in Myanmar, they wanted to reduce rural urban inequality, then it doesn't make sense to follow the standard growth strategy of attracting huge multinationals who know how to concentrate wealth better than ever, right? It makes more sense to support more rural informal firms that are going to support broad-based linkages and more equitable development. Similarly, if Mozambique wants to support resilience, it doesn't make sense to follow the sort of get-rich-quick approach of specializing in raw material exports, but rather focus on building, really resilient ecosystems and also, a more diversified and locally embedded economy. Now, all of this really ultimately led me to the Wellbeing economy movement, which is starting out from a different point of really asking the question, what is the purpose of the economy? What is the economy and how are we ultimately evaluating its success? Because currently we're evaluating the economy's success by its capacity to support itself, right? And we generally use an aggregate index of GDP, which tells us the monetary value of everything we're producing and consuming, but with the logic that all that is needed for a good life is more stuff, yeah? But ultimately, it doesn't really provide a space to ask whether what we're producing or how we're producing is actively improving our collective quality of life. And so with the green sort of growth agenda that we're seeing now, it's still very much based on this logic that economic growth is the right North Star for us to hold. And it really prescribes that if we're trying to achieve growth, then it makes sense to encourage the large investors and corporations that are most efficient at driving that growth. And one of my favorite PSA memes recently was this PSA that's like reminding us that electric cars are here to save the automotive industry and not the planet, right? And so the vision of green growth is one where we can continue the relentless sort of pursuit of wealth and profits through the exploitation of people and planet and try to decouple that from emissions by adopting greener technology. But it still doesn't allow us to recognize that the economy is just a part of our societies embedded with a larger ecosystem. And so we have to take a step back and not evaluate it by its capacity to just grow any activity as quickly as possible, but really say, what do we want to grow and why? Because that's the only way that we can start to identify the regenerative and circular, more self-determined mechanisms of actively not only healing the planet, but ensuring more just and equitable outcomes.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. I'm going to turn now into Bhumika and Lily. I mean, if you want to comment also on the diagnostic, but also hearing your inputs on what kind of alternatives, if an economy centered on care and sustainability of life is actually possible, where to start building that one. But Lily, do you want to start also if you want to comment on the original question? Oh, Lily, I don't know if you're muted.
I'm on mute now. Can you hear me? Okay, no, that wasn't a technical glitch. It was just a human error of muting myself. Okay, so the first point I'd like to make is I'd rather not use the word growth because it really is a veneer for something else behind it, right? it's really what's driving the system that we have is profit accumulation, right? Profit extraction and wealth accumulation, more precisely. That is the very core logic of the current system. And you can't address the issues that the crisis, the climate crisis in this case, that the system has generated by maintaining that same core logic. So the system itself cannot transform itself because it's going to go against its very core logic. Profit extraction and wealth accumulation is really what's behind what has generated the climate crisis. It's not just the use of fossil fuels. The fossil fuels concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere has reached excessive levels. We need greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. That's the only way to have warmth for the planet that can sustain life. The problem is not having greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The problem is having it at such excessive levels that it has started warming the planet. And if the system is still about profit accumulation, then it's not going to allow the kind of very fast, just, and equitable transition to a new system that will save us from climate catastrophe. And we're seeing this. It's not just a claim we're making. We're seeing this right before our eyes. I'm now in Bonn at the climate talks. And how to solve the climate crisis is not rocket science. We have the answers to that. It's just that governments and corporations are refusing to do what they should do because they're still all about protecting profit extraction and wealth accumulation. So just on that first point, it's not going to provide the solution. It's actually being a deterrent to the kind of solutions that are actually already clear and is actually very possible. And just to, again, illustrate it, I think to also further what Nicola was saying, even if we presume, for instance, that this system, under this current system, we are able to make a 100% transition to renewable energy, which is, will, take away 80% of the greenhouse gas emissions. What kind of system are we going to have? Will it be any more equitable, any less inequitable, or any less unjust? We're talking about, for instance, the extractivist relations between North and South. 80% of the critical minerals needed for renewable energy systems are found in the South, are being extracted in the South, but most of it is not being used in the South. So if we're going to do this quick transformation to 100% renewable energy, we're going to have a lot of extraction in the South, maybe 10 times more than what is currently being done of these critical minerals. Most of them will go to the US and to Europe, to the global North. That will allow you to do your 100% renewable energy systems. And most of it will not be made available for our use. And we will still deal with energy poverty, even if the world is now 100% renewable. I mean, that's even assuming that this current system that's dominated by corporate interests is going to allow a fast transition to renewable energy. And so alternatives have to be moving away from that core logic of profit extraction and wealth accumulation. Alternatives has to be anchored on the logic of providing for human life, so that human life means that we have the basics that we need, that it is decent, that it is dignified, and that people and communities are empowered. This is not about, it should not be about wealth accumulation. So that would be where I would start first, that the core logic has to be transformed. So we can't have the same system and just, do cosmetic changes as far as energy systems are concerned. The second is that we need to, because we're talking about care economy, we need to be able to value social reproduction and care as much as production of goods and services. Care and social reproduction, which is now being seen as primarily the work of women, is not equally valued because care and social reproduction does not generate profit. right? So it's seen as lesser work. It's seen as, secondary pursuits of human life. So it's the center of everything is now production and profit making, so that it's not just the primary responsibility of women. So that's being put on on women as a burden. It's also seen as not as valuable work, right? So that is one of the basis, the material basis why women in the workforce are receiving much less wages than the men for equal work. That is why a lot of the care work that is privatized and socialized are still the responsibility of women. And therefore, one of the fundamental kind of change that we need to make is that care and social reproduction must be seen as equal, and it has to be redistributed. It should not just be the problem of women, and it should be socialized. It's not just a private problem of families to be sorted out and addressed. Or if you can't address it within the household, you have to access the care through markets, through privatized services. So that needs to be also a major one. But of course, there's a lot of other things, including what you said, Yolanda, in the beginning. It's about changing the inequitable and exploitative relations among countries, across countries, between the global north and the global south, but also within the global north and the global south. It's also within countries. So there's a lot of, I think, very core important requisites for what this alternative system must be anchored on. But I've talked too much already, so please go ahead, Bhumika.
Thanks a lot, Lily. Before you go on, Bhumika, I want to introduce one of the issues that Lily was already talking, which is the role of the public, the role of the state. So in those alternatives, and please go ahead also in going back to the first question, but in those alternatives in this new economy, and against the backdrop of the focus on market-based solution of the green capitalism, what should be the role of the state, of the public sector?
Thanks, Yolanda. No, I just following up on the extremely critical things everyone's already said. My fellow panelists are on the spot. I just like to sort of zoom out and yes, talk about the role of the state for sure, but perhaps, one of the contexts that we need to locate ourselves in is that, we are in a global economy that has been characterized by some really key broad features, right? And when we look at neoliberalism and its enduring agenda of liberalization, privatization, and deregulation, we need to look at the ways in which it changes forms while maintaining the same logic of extraction and dependency creation. And the current era of financialization, where private capital markets, private investors, institutional lenders are actually shaping the contours of national policy making, not just encroaching on economic sovereignty, but essentially laying out, the rules of the game, where demonstrating investability, attracting investment in developing countries has become the primary driver superseding the economic and social rights of citizens. So when we say that there is an enabling environment creation for private capital investment, we're really looking at a continuity of that neoliberal, ethos, where financial markets, institutions, and elites have not just dominating the global economy, but are setting policy making and reorienting the role of the state. So the role of the state, this is extremely critical right now. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say the role of the state is being hijacked in new and deeper ways. We are seeing right now a reversal of the role of the developmental state, in that we see today how the state is being effectively deployed to protect and facilitate markets, lenders, and creditors. Now, this is being done through a vast constellation, right? Not just policies, but legislation, deregulatory regimes, the creation of new institutions. We see how in the IMF loans, they are monitoring and assessing fiscal rules and legislation. In particular, the loan in Sri Lanka has initiated a kind of diagnostic assessment for the first time since the Asian financial crisis loans in the late 90s. So this sort of monitoring developing countries and disciplining them in order to maintain that enabling environment is really key. So the thing I'd like to challenge all my colleagues here at this very important forum at Eurodad is that, you know, rather than the widespread perception that the role of the state has been shrunk or rolled back, we have seen over the last several decades how the state is not shrinking. It's not at all shrinking. It is being asked and tasked to maintain this enabling environment in a new form that goes beyond the Maastricht Treaty, right? The European Union's Maastricht Treaty was about fiscal discipline, it's about the inflation targeting of 2%, the fiscal deficit of 3%, and the debt to GDP ratio of 60%. And this fiscal discipline, this lack of monetary sovereignty is being maintained, but imbricated on top of it, layered on top of it, is the Wall Street consensus de-risking state, where governments are expected to escort private capital and reduce the risks of investors and lenders through any and all means possible. This means rerouting national policy, deregulation, public financing in order to demonstrate that investability. So we see this neoliberal ideology in practice today. It's not really about the self-regulation of markets as autonomous entities. It's actually about the state being tasked to create as much of a red carpet as possible for private capital and profit accumulation at the expense of a national development strategy, at the expense of social equality, at the expense of principles like common but differentiated responsibilities that ought to be guiding climate justice. And certainly overturning the rights-based economy. So this project, is of the de-risking regime. It is about developing strong institutions. It is about developing very robust legislation, but not to liberate markets, but rather to encase, protect, and feed markets. And this is exactly at the expense of people. So what is a developmental state? What is the ask? I think where we need to go in the global justice movement is really clearly articulating our yes. We always have a very critical and extremely elaborate analysis usually on what the problem is. We certainly focus overwhelmingly on the international financial institutions and on the coloniality of the global economy. And we have, such incredible analysis of what the problems are. But what are we proposing? What is our propositional agenda? What is the world we imagine? What is the state we imagine? What is a developmental state that has economic sovereignty, national policy space for development, where there is the eradication of TINA, there is an alternative, eradication of one size fits all. What is a social contract that is centered on a rights-based economy? So as Amanda also mentioned, it would be, that kind of progressive industrial policy of retaining ownership of key sectors, especially industry and banking, and deploying public resources to meet the social and economic needs of its people. So, we look to history. We look at how throughout history, there's been a guiding and supporting role of the state, where state intervention has governed the market, to develop human resources for agricultural reform that actually creates a diversification of the economy, for that production and investment linkage, for local content creation, not just being plugged into global value chains at the most lowest value node in the most commodity dependent form. And really we're talking about contesting the decades-old export-oriented industrial model, which we don't talk about enough, how the export-oriented economic model is still very much at the root of the debt crisis we see today. It's at the root of the chronic trade imbalances, where the imports are always far higher in the cost than the export revenues that are coming from a very narrow sliver of commodity crops, of natural resources, without the ability to create value added, especially through manufacturing, services, diversifying, creating jobs, creating decent work, and that age-old virtuous cycle between creating employment, wages, productive investment, and particularly public fiscal space. So just to center, what we are looking for is that developmental role of the state that is based on a rights-based economy where long-term public financing, patient capital for social provisioning to fulfill economic, social, and human rights is centered.
Thanks a lot, Bhumika. I want to go back to Nicola, and then I'll get back to you, Amanda, and Lily in a second. I think Bhumika has very well expressed how the state has actually been used to promote this neoliberal agenda, and she started to outline what kind of developmental state we need. But I would like to ask you if you can go a little bit more into detail of what kind of role for the state, and particularly on public investment, we would need. Obviously, Nicola, you will be also talking from the perspective of someone in a global north country, so also what is the role of the state in the global north? Okay.
Thank you. I'll try. Yes, maybe to add to Bhumika, so thank you very much, Amanda and Lydia, for because I really agree with you. And now adding to what Bhumika just said, the role of public finance for a green and just or eco-social or eco-feminist transition. I think Bhumika already said it already. I think the problem here is that public finance for so many years has been married to the private sector in order to de-risk. I think the problem is basically the de-risking and to turn in transition projects, which could be good and are necessary, turning them into bankable projects. So I think this is the main problem behind. And the solution, what is it? Well, we have to keep the public financing out of this logic and direct them to those transition projects which really need financing. And then getting more into the concrete, because I think we have talked a lot about economic governance, about global economy, but I think the key point, and this also goes now into concrete steps, but what can we do already to go step by step, putting into forward an eco-social transition, is those small initiatives which are already going on. Support those small initiatives you have in your countries, in your territories. I'm now speaking really much with a point of view from somebody living in Catalonia, so we are in the global north, but in the European south, so we have these two phases actually in Catalonia, but here really much money is needed to go, for example, for small-scale community-based projects. When we take, for example, the energy transition, we don't want mega infrastructure projects which are designed with a logic of capital accumulation. We want to get the money to those small projects who maybe don't have an economic return, but who have really huge impact on their communities, on improving the social well-being of the people living there, who have gender dimensions in the way they work with, for example, take the energy communities. In some countries they have already been developed, but we are really on the we're in the forefront now in Catalonia to develop those new and small scale energy projects, energy communities, which are really transformative because they question those accumulation of capital model. Also think about alternatives when we talked about mining. No? there are already initiatives about urban mining, secondary mining. Take those materials and those things which are already in the economical system on your locality, use it, get the minerals out of those projects and don't get it out of the soil from other territories. I think most solution maybe for Lydia, to add what Lydia said, I was really I agree with the need to reorganize and reevaluate the essential jobs we need in this transition. So we really need to tackle the sexual and international division of labor. We need to put those jobs in the center which are necessary for our life, basically. We need to guarantee those collective rights which are necessary for our transition. So, or think about elements like resources and essential works, like all around water, energy, housing, food, education, health. There's so much already projects going on who defend those common goods. It's about for example, there's a lot of projects in Catalonia who have been fight for the re-municipalization of water. This is definanciarization of common goods who have already been captured by big corporations, but we can re-municipalize them. We can take it back again into a public domain and defend it as a common goods. I know maybe I would leave it here because maybe my colleagues have more proposals, and then I won't.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Nicola. Amanda, let's go back to you a little bit also on this basis and premises for the alternatives and the role of the state. You said before you have been working on industrial policies, so maybe you have some insights on this alternative model, what characteristics it should have.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the interesting things for me has been actually going from working in international development to now working with the Wellbeing economy movement, which is largely, I would say, centered at the moment in the global north and in high income countries. Because I would say that actually a lot of the strategies aren't that different. I think the major difference is that, you know, the majority world is much more constrained by our global economic system, whereas higher income countries tend to be more constrained by an arrogance that makes them think they don't need a development plan in the first place, right? And so generally, I mean, first of all, I'll just say like the Wellbeing economy movement, it comes under a lot of different banners like post-growth, degrowth, circular economy, solidarity economy, business for the common good, and many others. But at its heart is this idea that we need to stop treating people and planet like they're here to serve the economy and start treating the economy like it's here to serve us, right? And so especially from a government point of view, it's about starting and centering the things that truly matter for our current and future well-being, like our health or social connections, a thriving ecosystem, and then really designing and evaluating our economies by their capacity to deliver on this. And so this shift from growth to well-being is, you know, it's been really interesting because it obviously really has had huge like sort of implications for our understandings of what constitutes development, because, you know, for a very long time, we've held this idea that if we can just grow our economies fast enough, then we can generate enough wealth that at best, right, from a neoliberal perspective, it'll trickle down and leave everybody else like better off, or from a more traditional social welfare sort of perspective, that we can take some of that wealth through taxes to fix the damages done to people and planet in the process, right? And what's interesting is that we're in a moment of a clear sort of paradigm shift where even in the richest sort of communities, people are questioning this logic, with 74% of people in the G20 countries, the supposed winners of this economic system, really arguing that the economic system should be working to support the health and well-being of people and planet, not to just focus on producing wealth and profit. And that's pretty profound, right? Like the majority of people recognize like that there needs to be a different orientation point for our economic system. And so we're seeing in higher income governments, for example, we have helped to develop the Wellbeing economy governments, which is currently comprised of New Zealand, Scotland, Iceland, Finland, Wales, and Canada. And they've all developed alternative indicators to GDP, which are evaluating their national progress by their level of like social and ecological well-being. And that, I guess from my experience in this space, like the beyond GDP movement is definitely what was once fringe is really becoming more mainstream now. And even GIZ, like a development organization, recently their future forum or their annual gathering was really on this question of should we develop a new definition of progress, which is not based on growth, but is really based on well-being, which to me, I could, would have never thought that that would have been a discussion that would be happening. But I think one of the issues is that with sustainable development in the SDGs, we see a lot of governments trying to elevate the social and the environmental to the level of the economic. And it gets a little bit confusing because they're not commensurate, right? And so it's about downgrading the economy, recognizing it's a means towards social and ecological goals. And that's really tricky because we've internalized this logic that that makes us feel, for example, I was like on a call with the WHO last week, that they still feel the need to make the case for why health is good for the economy, rather than feeling like they can swap that burden of proof and say, how would we evaluate the economy in terms of its contribution to our health, right? Recognizing that human health is clearly a higher level outcome than economic growth itself. And so all of this is sort of to say that I think we're at a really interesting moment where we're starting to see this fundamental sort of redefinitions by governments of progress. And whilst this is, I would say, right now in my the well-being economy movement seems to be very centered in high income countries and governments, which I think is fair because let's be honest, we're the problem 100%. I honestly, for me, I think that what we need to do is to recognize that the concept of that we're talking about is not new and it's not our own, right? Like it comes from indigenous paradigms and alternative development perspectives like Bon Vivir and Ubuntu and Swaraj, and philosophies that recognize like that true progress is living in harmony and balance with one another in our natural environment. And so I think that what we are seeing is a need to almost reverse this development logic so that we can really elevate and amplify the types of alternative cultural and economic systems that are giving back to the earth as much as they're taking and are based on real reciprocity and care, so that we can build these alternative sort of systems that can truly be inclusive and resilient in the future.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Amanda, for this. Lydia, I'm going to get back to you on one specific issue that your lab works on, and I know IPMDD also, which is the role of the global economic governance. I reckon you agree with me that the existing global economic governance is not fit for purpose if we need to change the system. So what kind of changes do we need there? Where do we start? Why is this a relevant issue for our work in terms of changing this economic model?
So before I answer that question, Yolanda, I also wanted to weigh in about the role of the states, but this time, aside, in addition to kind of like reconceptualizing that in general terms, of course, that begins with first the notion that the state's first responsibility is to its citizens and to ensuring that there is justice, there is promotion of equality, there is robust care for its citizens and so on. But I'm just thinking of two immediate things and basing it also on our discussion. One is the challenge to the states in the North is to ensure that reparations is paid to the South. I think there should be a very clear acknowledgement of the whole history and continuing practice of wrongs being done to the South just to perpetuate this profit accumulation and wealth concentration in the North. And the states must lead this reparations process. They should tax the corporations and the wealthy elites. The reparations cannot be done on the burden or on the back of the exploited people in the North. That's not what we're asking. They also should pay reparations to the people that are continuously being exploited in the North, especially Blacks, African Americans in the US, for instance, the diaspora community, workers, and so on. So this is not just about the exploited people in the South. There's exploited people everywhere. But there has to be that recognition of the historical and continuing wrongs, and reparations must be paid. And we need those reparations because we need that to have a big boost in the South for our states to do their obligations, which is, and building on what Bhumika is saying, we need to turn around our economies away from this orientation of producing for the global markets, exports, and then being debt dependent and import dependent. I mean, that's a huge task that requires a lot of resources. And our governments must use the resources from reparations, which includes the delivery of climate finance, by the way, which is an obligation of the global North governments. They should use that resources in order to turn our economies away from this current structure and orientation, which is the legacy of colonialism. That's how our economies are structured, and our crazy elites and governments are not going to move us away from there unless we really compel them to do so. And which brings us to our role at this point, aside from working for immediate reforms that are not just about making things less worse, but should be about really challenging and undermining the core logic of this system, so that we lay the foundations for more system-wide changes that are not going to happen overnight. So we need to be persistent about it. And then global governance, which is very important in this process. Of course, we can't expect current global governance rules and arrangements to move us really away from this system, because current global governance rules and arrangements are based in the power imbalance that exists, that you mentioned earlier, Yolanda, in your introduction. The global governance arrangements that we have are rooted in, based on, and perpetuating that logic of asymmetry in power, the logic of exploitative relations. So we can't expect that current global governance rules and arrangements is going to make the changes that are necessary. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't engage current global governance rules and arrangements, because engagement is about, as I said, making important immediate changes, but also laying down the foundation so that these current rules and arrangements are going to be replaced. I don't think it can be done with just, some cosmetic reforms in the system. So we have to choose our battles very well, so that the reforms we are seeking in the immediate don't end up making them look better, but not really changing their logic, but should be about laying down the ground so that we can undermine that core logic and, lay the grounds for another kind of logic that must replace these institutions. I mean, the replacement there is not just a simple thing of shutting them down and setting other things up, but the replacement also has to involve changing that power imbalance. Because even if you create new systems, like there's a whole lot of talk about a South Bank or an Asian monetary fund, but if it's based on current power imbalances, we are not going to expect anything different from these institutions. So our work is not just about campaigning for these changes. We need to strengthen ourselves. We need to build our power. We can't just make demands from governments as they exist today. We should, but in addition to that, we should seek to transform the governments as they exist today. So it's really a very political process.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Lily. I'm going to turn into Bhumika now to continue on this issue. How do we do this? How do we challenge the power imbalances? How do we build more power in the global South, particularly? How do we build more power within the people? Because it's not just about governments, as Lily said. How do we advance towards a different global economic governance that actually is fit for purpose for the changes that we want to make in the system?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, tall order. But look, I mean, most or many of our organizations, we focus on global economic governance. I mean, that's been my work in terms of international financial architecture reform and equitable global governance, global economic and financial governance for the last 15 plus years. So this is at the heart of everything. So for me, global economic governance is about creating a rights-based economy. And I think it's important that we say rights. It's important that we say rights in order to exactly avoid that instrumentalization. We don't need to instrumentalize women's participation in labor participation. We don't need to instrumentalize the value add, any kind of investment can yield to the GDP growth metrics, right? And a rights-based economy is precisely about a redistributive justice, redistributive reparations to counter a long colonial legacy of intersectional inequalities, and in particular, racial and gendered capitalism, right? So the reparations is really about the structural change through global economic governance that's required. And structural change is not merely about policy, it's about power asymmetries, it's about power balance, it's in particular about the structural power of finance and financialization today. It is about the systemic wealth drain, the systemic resource and wealth drain from the global south to the north, right? We know numbers like rich countries drained 152 trillion from the global south since 1960. Imperialism never ended, it just changed form. That's Jason Hickel et al.'s paper from 2000, I believe it's 2020 paper. So we know, the astronomical figures in tax and debt injustice. We know the South's fiscal space is under siege due to current systemic interest rate hikes and the unjust spillovers to currencies and reserves across developing countries points to the weaponization of the dollar, which really underpins the global economy, right? That you have a US dollar reserve currency that disables the ability to use monetary policy and central banks for development. But in terms of resource drain, I think it's helpful to point out that, interest rate hikes in just the last 1 year, cut approximately 360 billion of future income for developing countries, excluding China. The South has transferred an estimated 4.2 trillion in interest payments to North-based creditors since 1982. 4.2 trillion far outstrips any calculation of aid or concessional lending during the same period. Governments around the world lose an estimated 483 billion, according to Tax Justice Network, Global Alliance for Tax Justice, 483 billion approximately in tax revenue per year to tax havens. So when we look at the systemic wealth drain, systemic resource drain, and then, the audacity of the narrative of the financing gap. Well, of course, there's a financing gap. Of course, there is, real, a deficit in the public coffers. So this is the role of global economic governance, is to address the systemic drain. And the systemic drain ought to be addressed through, first and foremost, voice, vote, and representation, right? The South is rule makers, not rule takers. This is what our colleagues in AfriDad and African Network on Debt Development have been saying, rule makers, not rule takers, where the voice and participation of developing countries in macroeconomic decision-making is the litmus test for legitimate and democratic economic governance. Let's look at the IMF's executive board. I think all of you must be aware of how incredibly skewed the IMF's executive board is, where rich countries hold over half of the voting power. The developing countries, which constitute 85% of the world's population, have a minority share. The US has a veto vote. For every vote that the average person in the global north has, the average person in the south has only 1/8 of a vote. I mean, this is economic coloniality in the sense of the value of humanity in the south is 1/8 of that in the North in terms of the ability to shape decisions. So, you know, let's highlight that for the first time in 15 years, there's an ongoing 16th quarter review in the IMF that's considering a new formula to increase the vote share of developing countries. So this sort of redistribution and expansion of voting rights has long been one of our civil society priorities, but I also want to call it into question. I want to call it into question at this point because I think we have come to a point where we need to be wary of the expectation that the G20, G7, World Bank, IMF, or World Trade Organization can actually be a site of genuine multilateralism for global economic governance. And this then makes the factor of voice and vote, you know, important, but we need to more fundamentally ask, is their mission and mandate actually developmental? I think the World Bank and IMF as the Bretton Woods institutions, when they were conceptualized at their inception in 1944, the Bretton Woods Conference in New Hampshire, post-World War II, there were inklings of developmentalism. But after the fall of the gold standard and the turn in the World Bank to pushing export-led development models and liberalization, and the turn in the IMF to being lender of last resort and away from monetary cooperation, and the WTO as a site of deeply unfair trade rules now going into plurilateral, bilateral investment treaties and free trade agreements, we need to question whether we can actually keep advocating for reform in these international financial institutions where we now have almost 30 years of evidence that they keep morphing and transforming and distorting and evolving their regimes, their models, their policy agendas. Today, it's IFI reform is now proxy for basically de-risking the private capital. So we need to call into question, can we actually call upon the international financial institutions for a commitment to actual global economic governance for rights-based economy, for multilateralism, genuine multilateralism? So what then is the answer? What then is the way forward, right? And I think it's important, when we ask these questions, to maybe go back to history a bit. You know, in the 1970s, developing countries came together in a trade union of the poor nations. And this was the effort in the UN General Assembly to pass resolutions on a new international economic order, on a charter of the economic rights and duties of states. They're calling for redistributive justice, colonial reparations, sovereignty over natural resources, stabilization of commodity prices, and regulation of transnational corporations. I mean, there's a long legacy of institutions such as the, institutions to regulate corporations. Today, we have the binding treaty. We have examples of global economic governance for rights-based economy in the United Nations and throughout history that have been systematically squashed, undermined, or marginalized. And I think this is where the attention needs to be in looking at what is the legacy of global economic governance in the spirit of rights-based economy and economic sovereignty that have been systematically marginalized, and how do we work on reviving and supporting those sorts of forums and spaces that are democratic, that are accountable. And the financing for development in the UN is one such space, but we need to go far beyond and even look at regional spaces and coalitions between like-minded countries in the South for that kind of real global economic governance that is democratic and accountable. So I suppose I conclude with sort of feeling very hesitant that the World Bank and IMF can be called upon for genuine reform. We have seen over time that they actually take our advocacy and they co-opt it. They reroute it. When we talk about social safety nets, they now have social safety net provisions in the loans, but it actually doesn't make a dent in the austerity measures that reduce public spending or the monetary tightening that they prescribe. So it's a time for being very wary and very careful in how we approach World Bank and IMF advocacy.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Bhumika. I have one last question, but I would like to give you like this golden minute to finalize, we'll do a quick round and then we go into the room. We heard the reparations, redistribution, power rebalance, genuine multilateralism, the deprivatization of the commons, ending dependency, ending extractivism, stopping the drain. I mean, what to do with the Bretton Woods institutions. How we go from where we are, which is this profit accumulation, wealth extraction, as Lily said, system into that point B of alternatives. So a quick round, if you can be short, so we can have space for the people. I'm gonna start with Nicola, and then Amanda, Lily, and Bhumika. 1 minute. What strategies? How we go from one point to the other?
Yes, I think for me the main issue is small fights, actually, to go step by step. Also, Bhumika, I share with you the hesitation about reforming the global economic governance. So I'm really saying, no, we need these small fights in our daily lives. Who are going, who we can win. When I before talk, because we've talked a lot about global governance, but I think the key is on the local level, actually. It's on the local level, and we can gain these small fights where we put out, or we shift to a care economy because we put in other values in the center of our economic and relationships through each other. I mean, really practical, maybe some of you are already in some housing cooperatives and food cooperatives and involved in local energy communities, involved in mutual support networks. So this is really something which is needed, which is transformative, but doesn't have to do maybe with the global economic governments. But these are the spaces where we can really, where we can create capacities, we can create experience. So in the moment we need to scale up, we can scale up. So for me, this is the long-term strategy. And then just to add 1 minute, if we think, or if we are agents of social change, I don't know how everybody defines their roles in their organizations and their fights, but if we really feel like this, I think it's really important to live this transition. If we talk about ecofeminist transition, it's important to question our own education we have received in a patriarchal and racist society. And I'm speaking from a German perspective, living in the global north. It is important to question our privileges, our power we have, and do this also in the organizations. I think just look in the organizations, who's talking, who's taking the notes, who's carrying, who's bringing the coffee. So these are small steps, and these are really necessary but really important things to live this transition we are fighting for. And I think question this, not to feel bad about it, but to be aware about it and use your power and your privileges you have to put it for the common goods, basically. I think this is the solution, and this is the strategy we can use in the future.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Nicola. Very inspiring. Amanda, please go ahead with your golden minute.
So how do we get from A to B? I really think that a lot of times, especially in these discussions, the major constraint is our own imaginations when it comes to the economy. And so especially if we're talking about an economy of care, I think it's helpful, especially maybe to feed into your discussions here, to start with asking the question, what is the economy, right? So we define the economy as the way we produce and provide for one another. And so that's helpful to recognize that it's a means and method of improving our quality of life, and to remind us that we're lost if we forget that everything we produce comes first and foremost from the earth, and everything we provide is valuable insofar as it contributes to our well-being. And I think equally, when we recognize that the way we produce and provide for one another is going to be determined by our history, our policies, our culture, our geography, and so many other factors, we realize there can be no one size fits all economic model. And equally, there is no perfect alternative economic system waiting to be imposed upon us. We must build the better economy and system that we envision. And I think that often our imaginations become constrained because when we talk about the economy, we then speak about GDP growth rates or stock market values, maybe employment figures. And so that tends to make us think about the economy as a realm governed by businesses and banks. But obviously the way we provide for one another happens some by private enterprise, but also by government and NGOs. But perhaps the most valuable provisions that come from our families and our friends and our communities, which are motivated by care and remind us that the most valuable things are given freely. And so as with our mothers, Mother Earth has given freely. And just as we get older, most of us feel we need to give back to our mothers. So too do we need to give back to Mother Earth. And so personally, I see the economy of care as one of the most radical concepts in this space, as it actually really flips our contemporary economic logic on its head, which assumes that the value of something is only determined by its monetary value. Because this logic leads us to say that the only way we can value nature is to put a price tag on it. And similarly, the only way to value care work is to pay people for it. But as Schumacher said, there can be nothing sacred in something that has a price because it presents everything as fundamentally interchangeable. So we'd be saying that, the care I received by my mother, let's say just, an example, was worth $40,000 and thus functionally equivalent to a fancy patio set, right? That somebody might buy, when obviously the value of these things cannot be compared. And so I just want to leave that with you here because our current economic system is really based on assumptions of human behavior around competitiveness, selfishness, individualistic behavior, but we all equally have qualities, compassion, care, interdependencies. And so let's envision what a system would look like that would encourage and reward these former types of behaviors to build more reciprocal relationships.
Thanks a lot, Amanda. Didi, your turn. The floor is yours.
I think many of us are already trying to do what it should take for us to move from point A to point B. And that is we are waging a lot of fights, campaigns, advocacies, engagements. And we need to do this at all levels. I mean, I agree that we need to do it locally, but we also need to do it nationally, regionally, globally. And we need to do it fast. And because I'm probably very much thinking about the fact that addressing even the climate crisis, for example, this is the window of time that we have is very small and it's narrowing fast. Before we are hit with, the climate crisis in such catastrophic proportions. It's already in catastrophic proportions for many millions of people living in this planet. And we can't be taking our time because there's not much time left that we have. And we need to be imbued with this sense of urgency that, yes, we are doing what it takes, but we need to do it faster and more intense, more strongly. And I believe it's not just simply a lack of imagination for an alternative. I mean, our people know how to dream. We've been talking about alternatives for decades, and that many things that civil society movements and groups that have been fighting for are there. And but what we have before us, we must remind ourselves, are forces that use all possible sorts of power. Repression is there, militarization is there, private armies are there to fight against those who are trying to protest projects locally. These are very real constraints, and we need to develop our strength further, because those who are against the kind of changes that we are working for are not above using any kind of force, even though it leads to loss of lives in many instances. So yeah, we need to be also a lot more determined, because the going gets rougher. I think the closer we are to actually winning this fight to transform the system, the more desperate and the more cruel those who are against the change will be. I mean, we've known that in history, and we need to be quite prepared to do that. And yeah, so I hope that we feel that sense of urgency that, yes, we're doing a lot of things right, but we have to do more and faster. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Lily. I guess that's also a feeling that you feel very deep well-being in Bonn with those negotiations going on, and knowing that it's not going faster and ambitiously enough. Bhumika, last words for you.
Yeah, I just want to really follow the thread, Lydie, where especially, talking about the reality of the multi-dimensional and historical forms of power we are contending with, because the power we are contending with is not as simple as these reductive black and white binaries of North and South, of rich and poor. We're talking about the power of narratives, of ideologies, of belief systems, right? I mean, the neoliberal financialization is first and foremost a belief system. And this requires a culture shift. I mean, policy alone will not, is never going to be enough. And calling for the techno fixes is never going to resonate with a critical mass of people. But let's look at the power of disruption and how the power of disruption unfolds in these extraordinary moments when ordinary people rise up in anger and hope, defy the rules that govern their lives, and disrupt the workings of institutions in which they are, living in. So in recent years, we look at uprisings from Occupy Wall Street, the Arab Spring, and countless regional and local movements against inequality, and in particular austerity. In 2022 alone, a report by FES put out that there were 12,500 protests held across 148 countries on austerity issues, on cost of living crisis, such as food prices, power supply, inflation, cost of energy. And many of these protests were momentous. Governments were ousted and others transformed. So we need to keep in check these realities happening across the world, where there is such powerful disruption happening on local levels everywhere. In building the critical mass, again, I just want to also raise attention to the culture of resistance within our movements and within our organizations. Oftentimes there is a very clear, palpable culture of toxic burnout, of exhaustion, where the work of doing, policy advocacy and movement building and resistance and change, we see over the years how people drop out, how it is not able to sustain a critical mass, not able to create a culture shift. So really looking within our own organizations, our own relationships, at the forum, this is an incredible, powerful place to sort of question what kind of community we are creating. Are we creating solidarity, shared values, humanity, connection between us? Because if we want to build critical mass, it starts with us building a sustainable and humane culture between ourselves as well, where we invite other people in, where we really do that intersectional work of boundary struggles, where we build between movements. There is incredible movements from local to regional to global, where systemic shift, where redistributive justice, reparations can come together for a profound culture shift. But it starts with creating a culture that is sustainable, and also with countering narratives with the propositional. I agree that we have been radically reimagining the world economy for a long time. but perhaps creating that critical mass, we can look to history with the history of the civil rights movement, the history of anti-colonial movements, the history of the feminist movements, especially in the era where they came together from North and South in sort of the Beijing Conference era. We look to history to look forward on how we can create that kind of systemic change. Thanks.